Thanks, Magda. I now have the honor of introducing our guest speaker today. Dr. Magomola is a veteran businessman and retired banker who has been at the helm of various companies, primarily in the financial sector, for over 45 years. He's currently deputy chairman of the Development Bank of Southern Africa, where he also serves in the board, credit and risk, as well as nominations committees. Credited as one of the fathers of Black economic empowerment in South Africa, Magomola was an early campaigner for the positive inclusion of Africans in the mainstream of the country's economy. His leadership and influence were felt in some of the country's largest companies. He credits some of his successes to organize business associations such as the National African Federated Chamber of Commerce, Foundation of African Business and Consumer Services, and Black Business Chamber, which he was founding member of. The influence of these chambers permeated all sectors of business, and together they formed powerful lobby groupings. Dr. Magomola is a former political prisoner on Robben Island who served time alongside some of the giants of South Africa's liberation struggle in the 1960s. In 2022, he was honored with the Distinguished Chancellor's Robben Island Alumnus Award. He's also the recipient of several awards, including an honorary doctorate in Commerce and Economics from University of Zululand, Freedom of the City of Birmingham, the Black Management Forum Business Excellence, to name a few. Thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Magomola. Over to you and Prof. Makoni.
Thank you.
Okay. It's my great pleasure, Dr. Magomola, to engage in a collegial conversation with you. One of the issues that became quite clear as the forum developed was that we needed to engage with people who have got intellectual and political expertise, but operate outside universities. So when that idea clarified, our mutual friend suggested that no, the ideal person to start with in this would be Dr. Magomola. And thank you very much for accepting our invitation. I want to start off with a fairly innocent question so that the members of the audience get a sense of who is the person in front of us. Can you just sort of briefly describe for us your background and what your early childhood life was like? Can you just provide some context so that people can have a sense of who they are talking to?
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be part of this, and I hope that your listeners and all the participants will enjoy this session. I'm a South African born just after the Second World War, in a mining town called Randfontein or Venterspoort, which is in the west of Johannesburg, some 30 miles west of Joburg, as we call it. My father was a miner, and he worked, and I was raised in a mine owned by the Anglo-American Corporation. Strange enough, my wife actually is associated with the Anglo-American Corporation 60 years later. But be that as it may, I grew up in that environment, in a settlement known in South Africa as a location. And that is a colloquial meaning that a place designated for Black people outside of a white town. So every magisterial district has a township or a location. That's where I was born and raised among other kids. Very much ignorant of what was happening around me until, and that's where I went to kindergarten school. And later I moved to to primary, not too far away from where I went to kindergarten. And in 1956 or so, I started my high school. High school in a place called Krugersdorp, still within the neighborhood, now within the radius of 30 miles, because there was no high school where I lived. And one of the interesting features of my life there in high school was the encounter with the now departed Archbishop Tutu, who was my teacher. And I always used to tease him during his life that he's partly responsible for my fortunes and misfortunes. Because he's the one, I think, who planted the seed of politics inside me. So I was arrested shortly after my last year of high school. After I started work, I was expelled from high school because of my political activities, I might say that. I wasn't allowed to proceed into the final class of high school. So that year I worked, and because, again, this is an interesting background, maybe, because I live in a location and the laws of South Africa are such that if you're Black, you live here and you may not seek employment outside of that magisterial district. So while I was looking for employment, I realized that there were not enough opportunities where I lived. So I needed to climb higher in the society of South Africa, of Black, colored, Indian, white being best, Black being worst. So I got through that by bribing a colored woman, which is a status above Black, slightly silky woolly hair, and they call them colors, and I think Tabua would know and Funda would know what I mean. But I needed to give her some money. It's very basically bribing to obtain a little ID to allow me more mobility to get work. That's how I got work. While I was 12 months into that job, it was March 1963, is about the time I got arrested. That is basically for my political undertakings. And that's really, and a lot had happened. A lot had happened during that period, and I think I must make the point that having painted that background about my life and my beginning career of work, I can safely state that I had become aware during that period of the denial of my basic rights as a human being for the reasons I've just given you in short. And through the influence of the personalities like Bishop Tutu and others, I became, aware of my reality. In fact, I could safely say that my own reality as a human being in the universe was visiting upon me. And that's how I realized that there are certain things around me that don't seem right and don't seem to accord to human principles. And that was the beginning of my learning of, and of course, my steps towards getting arrested. But that's really my kind of life in my first, say, 18 years of life, because I was arrested when I was 19.
And what was the nature of the youth politics during this particular era? For example, were the youth in contact with other youth? Did you mutually politically conscientize each other? How did the politics operate amongst the youth and people of your generation at that point?
I engaged during my youth in what I can describe as the politics of positive and activism and liberation struggle.
Okay.
I say that, and I describe it that way in the sense that I was not interested in the politics of negotiation.
Oh, I see.
Right.
Okay.
So I was interested in the politics of liberation, and liberation to me meant taking up arms.
Yes.
And liberating myself and along with those who felt like me. That was my politics.
Yes.
I had sufficiently learned from the time I had been in high school early through the influences I've mentioned earlier, that certain things weren't right. Riding the train from one spot to the other, I had to be in the third class.
Yes.
Although there was a second and first class, but those options were closed to me. And when I questioned why that was not possible, I was rudely reminded of my status and my existential life around me that permitted, well, that made it impossible for me to achieve that. So things were unraveling to me. And of course, I was fortunate enough to go to a high school where some of the teachers were already members of the liberation movement, i.e. the ANC.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Right. Okay. So we had this one particular teacher who was very conscious of his responsibility to teach us about education as prescribed in the syllabus.
Yes.
And also to tell us who we are and what we are being denied, during his spare time. And so that opened up my mind, and truly some classical thing that stays on my mind around that time was this one teacher. He would every day come when his class comes, he would draw the map of Africa. And then he would put a star where Ghana is located.
Yes.
And he would say to us, Africa resembles a firearm, a revolver. And the spark has been turned on in this spot. And we in South Africa are here at the end of the continent. And we have not reached that, but the influences are coming. So that's how I learned, Phoebe, to know who Dr. Kwame Nkrumah was, what he stood for, and it was, hold on, I've got grandchildren here.
Okay.
This was around 1956, 57, around the time Ghana gained its independence from colonial rule. So I lived a life of actually watching the liberation of the continent outside of Liberia, which had been freed when the former slaves were fighting. The first was Ghana, and we watched with interest because this was talking to me, the person. And then of course, the formation of the Organization of African Unity, which occurred in April in Addis Ababa, April 1963. I was already in prison, awaiting my trial. That created the momentum for us to understand that the African continent has an aggressive agenda to rid itself of colonialism. And so our turn inevitably would come. So that got me closer and closer into the struggle of liberation and the struggle of liberation politics, So so our colleagues, with the encouragement of seeing Ghana, Kenya, and all of these leaders like Odinga Oginga, Mzee Kenyatta, Kwame Nkrumah, Ben Bella, all of them grouping together to create this that was called the Organization of African Unity, which was preaching the gospel of a Pan-African philosophy. That appealed to me, and this is how I was able to join the bandwagon. And I think everything starts there. Really, that ended up with my imprisonment.
Yeah, I want to just ask another question, then I move on to the period after your imprisonment. Did you ever have discussions when you try and recollect now with your father, who was a minor, as your own political consciousness developed? And what were the conversations like? Or he never did, you never had that sort of intergenerational discussions about politics? he was too much preoccupied with earning a living, so to speak, that he never did engage you in your political.
That's an interesting and also embarrassing question for me, because I live with it, because father knew nothing. I mean zero about nothing. You know, he was a church minister. He was doing his thing. Lived in the church mission, and I was a brilliant young man inside the family household. But nobody knew what I did as soon as I crossed that fence to go to the street. So the old man found out on the day, of my trial, when I was sent, when he heard the evidence being led by some of the colleagues that had decided to become witnesses for the state against us. When my father heard that some of the meetings were held inside of his church, in the cemeteries of where we lived, and in such places that depict sacredness, my father was, because I was watching his face from time to time whenever I could in the courtroom, and it didn't seem like a very happy man. When I was finally sentenced, and he screamed in court, and he said to the judge, "You are wrong. It can't be my son you're talking about." And that was when we had been marched down the aisle to go and serve our sentences. So that summarizes in a bit of a long-winded way how my father was just trying to dramatize the situation to give effect to it.
What about your mother?
Well, I'm afraid that my mother did not experience any of this. She died only.
Okay.
My mother died when she was 33. In 1958, there was still, and she had been ill for a while, and sadly she passed on from pulmonary tuberculosis, and they hadn't really found a cure for it.
Now, let's move on to the imprisonment. When you look back now, what lessons did you learn from that imprisonment? First of all, about South African political institution, and about yourself as an individual.
When I landed in the first prison or Robben Island?
No, the first prison before we get to Robben Island.
Okay, yeah, because I got into a series of prisons, as you probably know.
Okay.
I've been into 6 South African prisons in my life, and all of them very hostile to political prisoners. So my first prison was in Krugersdorp High, and Krugersdorp, in the town of Krugersdorp, where we awaited trial, and while our case was being investigated by the special branch to create a winnable case for the state. And that was around 1963, from 1963 March up until June, July. And in fact, the OAU was founded while we were in prison in April. I recall well, one of us writing on the wall commemoration of the innocent, because we considered ourselves innocent. And we were in a hostile environment, most of us under 25, and the youngest was probably myself at about 19, or just buying for 19 or so. And it was it started with trauma, and I'm glad you asked for this, because my first prison experience, there were probably 24 or 25 of us in those cells. And we used to go to court for trial and remanded and get back to the prison cell. So during that time, the trauma arose out of this particular incident where four of the group members were removed, and my former high school mates with whom we had done all of this planning were removed from us, from the cells, and we were told that they would return. They're going to have to face some investigation about them having murdered a security branch policeman. Turned out it was a trumped up charge. And the sad, the horrid stuff about it is that we never saw them again. We heard a couple of months later that they had been sentenced to death, and all of them were executed. God bless their souls. That was the first experience and probably one of the most horrid ones of my prison life. But that's how I was Christianized, not sorry to use that word, introduced into prison by that harsh experience. We lived through it through our trial. And we were supposed to appear before a judge who had the right under the Sabotage Act to sentence us to death or up to 20 years. We escaped that with relatively light sentences of some 6 to 8 years, average for all of us. But that's the first experience. Then in between Krugersdorp, we went to Johannesburg, a prison called the Fort, still awaiting trial, closer to the trial. And I just note that Cambridge University has actually taken a chapter out of my book on the experience of the Fort prison. Not enough has been written about it, but I devoted a chapter in my book on that prison. That was a haven. I had never thought that prison was anything like that, but it's very well captured in a chapter of my book where we were mixed with criminals, the most hardened of them, murderers, robbers, and so on. And we spent I think almost 6 weeks in that prison, because it was close to the trial to the court. And almost, as I state in my book, almost all major modern political prisoners in South Africa have gone through that prison. Nelson Mandela did, Robert Sobukwe did, Mahatma Gandhi did. In fact, our cell was adjacent to where Mahatma Gandhi was. Gandhi was imprisoned, and Winnie Mandela, Albertina Sisulu. When I say most of your activists in South Africa have been to, if there's one prison that is common to all of them, it's the Fort prison. So that's where we were sentenced from. And then I could spend a whole day just describing the circumstances around the Fort prison, but I would advise the listeners to refer to a chapter that I said has just been republished by Cambridge on the Fort prison, which is still alive and has been turned into our constitutional court today.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So, my friend and colleague, Chief Justice Museneke, served 10 years in prison on Robben Island. I'll get back to that. But after all those many years, he came to serve as the Chief Justice of the land at the prison where we were. That's how much, that is the irony of the South African sort of political milieu. But I have made it my business to, whenever I get a chance, to visit the prison. Sometimes been requested to come and give a lecture to visit us to the Constitutional Court, but this judge spent all of his life as a justice overlooking the prison where we all spent time prior to being transferred to Robben Island. So the last prison that I talked was a Leocorp prison. After we had been sentenced, we only spent about a month there. When President Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963, I think November 22nd or so, we were in that prison. And we got into trouble because I smuggled a newspaper in, I don't know where we found it, and that's how we read about President Kennedy's assassination in Texas. And for that, I received a very good punishment of 6 days without food in this isolation block as a form of punishment, and lost a couple of pounds. And they taught me a bit of a lesson on how to behave in prison. So that's another of my experiences that I took away with to Robben Island. It is from that prison that we went from Robben Island.
And what about your experiences in Robben Island? What is most memorable about? Memorable is not a good word, but what stands out for you when you think about your stay at Robben Island?
That Robben Island became my second home for where my youth was really spent or stolen away from me. I have described the scene in many ways for those who care to listen or read. You know, when we left Leocorp, we were all handcuffed. There were 100 of us.
Yes.
There were exactly a group of 100. One morning, they just pounced on us and they said, "You have been transferred to Robben Island." And we were given a new set of clothing, short pants. It was in the summer of December 1963. And then handcuffed at the wrist and shackled in leg irons at the ankles. And you had to select a mate and say, "I want to be handcuffed with this man," because the journey was going to be a 2-day journey, handcuffed and shackled in the trucks that transported us from Johannesburg to Cape Town and then on to Ireland. So I selected the man who was my neighbor, who was my vice chairman of the cell or the branch that I headed up. And so off we were on those police trucks with little ventilation, all the way to Robben Island, which became a 2-day journey. I keep mentioning to some folks that the trip was hard enough to be with. There were 5 trucks, 20 in each truck, and we handcuffed and shackled, but there were no toiletry facilities inside the truck. So 8 hours later, we arrived at another prison where we were kept overnight to break the journey, and had to sleep with the shackles on and the handcuffs. There was no relief from that. So you can imagine when the call of nature comes, you have to take your handcuffed mate with, which is a terribly embarrassing situation, and the rest, I'll leave to your own imagination. So that is how we spent the trip from Johannesburg to Cape Town. Arrived the following day around 5 p.m. Still no relief from the shackles. got off the trucks, were thrown onto the boat, and the boat still is still a museum, and Robben Island is called the Dyers, and we were transferred from the Cape Town docks to Robben Island docks. Now, we arrived at the harbor late in the afternoon, and I under the blue sunshine of Western Cape. It's quite beautiful. But Robben Island can be deceiving, by the way, when you arrive there. From the harbor, as you arrive, you can see Table Mountain, which kind of shields the city of Cape Town from the gales, of where the Atlantic Ocean and the Indian Ocean merge. That's why some people call it the Cape of Storms. So I remember the agony many years later, while I was on Robben Island, of seeing the mainland and the city of Cape Town foreshore, because the island was so positioned as if to taunt us. You were on the island, and yet you could see civilized life on the mainland, just 10 kilometers away. So I think one of the first few years, probably one of the things that hurt me most was the fact that I started to miss a lot of things. I missed, I'd left my little brother and my little sister behind. And I missed even just the soft voices and aroma of females, which always brought a gentle breeze, inside me, especially thinking about the love and care and the gentle nature of my mother, So that's the kind of torture that is hard to communicate to anybody, because it goes to the soul and the inside of you. I think that torture in many ways was harsher than the physical torture we were exposed to over the many years. Over the 6 years I was there, I never received a letter or anything or a visit from anyone, because although visits were often allowed, it was at the expense of your family. Now, I had no mother who had since passed away. My father's health was deteriorating. He had been affected rather very negatively by my arrest. So his life was disintegrating in front of him. My brother and sister had to go look for shelter because there was no one to look after them. I was the eldest. And I think one of the things that kept me alive for so many years was just the objective of seeing myself returned to them and giving them some sort of life, because my father died soon thereafter. So that was one of the experiences, an emotional experience of the soul. But you ask what was I struck with by Robben Island? It was also the composition of the prison population. Remember, we were political prisoners, and then you had common law prisoners, who were separated from us, and the prisoners from Namibia, Herman Toivo and his group that had been arrested. And then in the other camp, there was the political prisoners, our senior leaders, Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, and the others that were separated in what we call the Kulukus, or the isolation block. So the point I'm coming to is that the caliber of the prisoners and the men I met there, remember, there were no women on Robben Island, and all prisoners are black and all warders are white and racist and very hostile. So the caliber of people that I met as a youngster was one that I owe my life to today, because it is their nurturing in many ways, a fatherly or parental nurturing. There were people as old as my own parents, as old as my uncles and so on. But more importantly, because we came from a diversity of cultures, local cultures, diversity of professions, because there were, it was a strange situation. Teachers were arrested along with their students during those days. The special branch would walk into a class and take entire profile of high school students, throw them into jail, arrest them, take them to Robben Island. That's how Seneke and others were arrested, and along with their teachers. So they go to university and it's a professor they suspect that has got political leanings. They would arrest the professor and the rest of the class of the professor. Then there were people of the cloth, the church people. The police would arrest the church congregants at the time, the men and the pastor. So it was that, that kind of mixture of people that had a consciousness and were sensitive to the fact that we were young and we needed to be nurtured. And that kind of nurturing took place. And we were able to be, and we, once we got into the cells, prison cells, and we'd been locked in, the leadership organized us into little cells, a group of 20 of young people, along with a leader, who those who have not, who were aspiring to learn, would be taught whatever they needed to be taught. But along with that, there was political teachings that took place inside the cell, and there was a lot of words of encouragement that this is just the beginning or the last kicks of the dying horse. So that helped us to, and we knew one thing for sure, that victory was certain. So that kept us alive. But on the lighter side of things, I think that there was also a bit of false hope that because the OAU had been formed and therefore these guys grouping together, there would be African military force that would come and free us. And every day when we look at the ocean and we see a boat there, we think, my gosh, there comes our freedom. But sometimes we just kind of crack about it. But all of those kind of incidents kept us alive. And some of us had an opportunity to study. I finished my high school in prison, and passed my everything I did with decent colors. And also because of the musician, the other part of me, by the way, probably that I'm a musician. I play musical instrument and I teach music. So I had my own class that I taught music, and I have people who have become professional musicians, and some of them give me the credit that it is my teachings that I gave them on Robben Island. And I still play the trumpet to this day. By the way, when I meet you one day when you're here, I'll play
yes, when I meet you, okay.
I'll play on Robben Island very well. But that was the kind of, now finally, being in Robben Island that long, there were people that also, like in Krugersdorp, were taken from us, sentenced, and the majority of them were sentenced to death. So for the most part, if not all, these were all on trumped up charges. So we lost some people along the way. Some died from natural causes, the harsh treatment on the island. One of our close friends from where we came from died, I think 3 weeks after we arrived. He couldn't take the harsh gales and the harsh wind and having to sleep on a felt mattress, one blanket, on damp cement floors. Something that President Mandela describes very well in his book, A Long Walk, how we got very disciplined in making up our beds, and you would swear you were entering into a military barracks if we got into our cells. But that was a sort of teaching. the sort of environment that kept us going. And when I was released to a prison called Victor Verster, which is about, on the mainland. That's and I spent another year there as a matter of, I don't know if it's important or not, but that's where President Mandela spent his last days. They built a little place for him on Robben on Victor Verster while he was negotiating with our captors on the terms of our release and under the terms of democracy in South Africa. So, in brief, that was what Robben Island was like to me, and I think to many of those who spent time with me during that period. As a matter of fact, if you do get a chance to go to Robben Island, there is a cell named after me. I left my trumpet that I played, and it's not. It's in the same area where that Dr. Mandela's cell is, but it's not as popular as his, of course, because I'm not him. But in case you get a chance to go, please do visit my cell. People call me from inside the cell listening to the music which I recorded while I was out there.
Yeah, I will visit your cell on condition that they give me a guarantee that they won't lock me in. I'm too much of a coward. Okay. Yeah. After Robben Island, how did your life unfold? Where to from there? When you were finally released,
well, after I continued to be shackled in a different way, they didn't give me a chance. I don't know what I did wrong on Robben Island, but the minister, when I was released, by the way, on the very first day Neil Armstrong came back from the moon, exactly on that day, 24th July, 1969. And just a short anecdote, as we were driven from the prison cells in Leeuwkop, where I'd started, being taken to another prison. I thought I was being taken to a place of release because it was my last day in prison. I'd served every minute and every second. And so my parents were waiting for me, my folks were waiting for me someplace, but I was driven to Pretoria. And then there were all these newspaper lamp pole headlines saying that man has returned from the moon, the Americans are back from the moon. And I didn't quite understand. I was with a mate of mine, and we asked the driver, who was a special branch, security branch policeman, what that statement meant, because we had no access to newspapers or radio throughout the 6 years we were out there. And he acted like we ought to know. And he says, don't you know that Americans have been to the moon and they're coming back today? We said, what do you mean the moon? The guy said, the moon. So, I always, every July the 25th, when I celebrate my release from prison, I always remember that experience that took me another 200 miles from where I was arrested to a place where I was to be kept in exile. Because the minister made a statement in the declaration that they gave me that I was not sufficiently rehabilitated in prison. I had not shown any remorse, and therefore they were sending me for another 2 years for further imprisonment. But it would be a light form of imprisonment, but I would work in an area where I would not be allowed to live go anywhere over 5 kilometers radius, but work in a farm, in a plantation with farm workers up until such time as I show remorse. So there was another 2 years of exile. After the 2 years, just before that, I found a way of escaping and came back to Johannesburg. And the upshot was that while I got married, met my wife, got married. The first woman I met that complied with what I built up in prison, I married her. And I'm glad she's been with me for 51 years now. So it's worked out pretty good. And so during my time of release, I was fortunate to receive a Fulbright scholarship, which brought me to the United States. And I'm still forever grateful for that gesture from the US government. And that that changed my life entirely.
Mhm.
And I spent my first couple of years in the Midwest, where I did some graduate work in business
Mhm.
administration. And thereafter, I found an internship, and I was later recruited by Citibank in New York and went to work in New York on
Mhm.
Wall Street. So that's why I wrote the book, From Robben Island
Yes,
to Wall Street.
yes.
Yeah.
Okay. That's very interesting. So now I want to ask you the last set of questions, because there are a lot of questions in the chat box. People want
Yeah.
to, yeah. You've written quite a lot and talked quite, and you've been quite active in promoting Black businesses and Black entrepreneurship in South Africa. When you think about it, how far successful has that project been? When you think about the strategies, I mean, because it appears, if I read your book correctly, promoting Black business was one of your main interests throughout, even up till now. How far successful have you been on that project?
I think we've been reasonably successful. South Africa has changed quite a bit on that's going on. I'm pleased to say it. That I say it, and that was my second level of activism. My first level of activism was politics.
Yes.
Second was Black business liberation, or the advancement of Black business and entrepreneurship. I made that a specific task for myself when I came back from the United States. I had had enough time in America to study about the history of minority business people. I had done my rounds, and I had been trained in banking. So I came back, and I was asked to. I worked for some of the major banks in South Africa at a senior level. And my last task in banking, before I did what I'm doing now, was the head of the first Black-owned bank in South Africa, which is a consequence of the efforts of what I had been preaching. It was all of my philosophy on Black business advancement and empowerment was based at the beginning on the assumption that the day of freedom would finally come, because we knew that victory was short in that respect. There would be democracy, or some form or hybrid of democracy. Now, the question was, South Africa remains a highly industrialized and commercialized country. And in my way of thinking, I did not see how this would all pan out, because political freedom does not necessarily, in my view, then at the time still is, pan out into economic freedom. It does not mean, just by virtue of having a Black president, you will have a Black president of the South African Reserve Bank. It doesn't work that way. Now, I got into a mode of preaching and creating awareness of the importance of creating Black business people and leadership, and in preparation, as important, in preparation of that day, so that we can, on day one, assume some positions of importance. There's going to be a minister of finance. It's going to be a minister of commercialization. And how are we going to do that without having prepared ourselves? A very short script here from my book. In 1986, when I came back, I made this statement that we, for any emerging nation to take its place among others and experience economic growth, it must own its own banks, pension funds, and financial pension funds, and so on, as a kit of survival, because there is no nation that can succeed if it doesn't own and control the financial institutions, which would then give effect, which would then give effect to the creation of enterprises, small and large, of similar organizations, particularly if they are Black. So I have written, I have spoken at conferences, you know, in a variety of places abroad and here. And in some circles, I know that I'm credited with having popularized this concept, but because I was president of some of these organized businesses for many years. But the consequence that really pleases me today is that when I was released from prison, there was not a single Black chartered accountant or CPA. Today, we count them in their hundreds. You know, there were no, I was president of a bank, but a lot of people would call me a teller, you know, because they were, you know, in my family, they would describe me as a teller at a bank. And much as I troubled, I said, I know I'm not a teller, I'm the president of the bank. You know, they could not live with that notion, you know, and many other people couldn't. So all of that has helped. And I meet a lot of young people, some write to me to this day, they're not young anymore, but they're in business, who tell me that thank you for inspiring us over the years. And I find a lot of satisfaction over that.
Okay. On that positive note, let me give over to Mfundo, because there are a lot of questions that were being raised in the chat box, questions, comments by our audience. Thank you very much, Gaby, for
thank you.
Conversation. I appreciate it. Yeah, Mfundo, the ball is in your court.
Baba Magomola and Professor Makoni, thank you so much for your insightful and thought-provoking conversation. So we do have a couple of questions on the chat box. So we have the first question from Ithu Malabie, and the question follows. I think you've partially answered the question, though. So as a young man in Robben Island, eager to learn and discover the world, how did you get through each day and keep sanity and be optimistic?
Well, Itu, hello, Itu. Itu is a banker. I know him quite well. He's my little brother, if I might say so. And I was, you know, there's this thing called centering yourself. You know, I came from a highly spiritual family. So one of my, you know, one of my beliefs was that there is a maker out there that can distinguish good from evil. So I'm trying to be a good person, and I've lived with that ethos in my life. That's one. So based on that, and I did not make that conscious decision while I was on Robben Island, Itu, of following the business line. That came when I was in America. But in 1960, when Dr. Mandela was released from prison, because we had met in prison and we had interactions with him, and here him, you know, I had met him the last time in 1964, in June or July. When he was released some 27 years later, I met him the first week and he invited me to his house. And we had this conversation because at the time he was contemplating nationalism and privatization. You might recall in South Africa, there was that huge debate. And one of the things he asked me, I remember when I entered the yard, the chairman of Anglo-American had also been invited. We entered his yard about the same time, but he called me in first and, you know, hugged and was very pleased to see that I'd grown from that 19-year-old to a responsible citizen of the country. So he asked me my view on this issue. And one of the things I shared with him was that there aren't enough of us, Mr. President, enough in the space to fill up these positions in mining, in agriculture, and in infrastructure, whatever it is, we just a handful. So we have to take a view that takes those realities into account. But what we need to do is to accelerate the growth of Black business people, train them, get them into chambers, send them abroad, become members of organizations like the Institute of Directors, which I joined in 1986 in London. And then we would have a core which would then influence the next group of leaders. So there was a gradualist approach to it, because the Big Bang would never have worked, and it never works really. So over time, as you know, when we have grown large businesses, and I will not mention them here, they're very well known to you, run, controlled, directed by Africans with large contracts, whether it be in agriculture, infrastructure. Today, I can tell you that we at my institution, have funded billions of dollars to Black business people in the area of renewable energy and clean energies, as well as women-owned companies, something that did not exist. But other banks and other financial institutions have also seen the need. But it just did not happen overnight. It is something that has evolved over a period of time, again, through the influences of organizations like the Black Business Chamber or Council, NAFCOC, FAPCOS, and BLSA, and a number of such business-friendly South Africans who saw the need to join in this campaign.
Okay, and then we have the next question from Michael Scott, and it reads as follows. Given the influence of Kwame Nkrumah on your political and intellectual Pan-African consciousness, I'm curious regarding any influence Patrice Lumumba may have had on your outlook and life more generally. How do you see his tragic demise and removal from the African scene in the light of ongoing horrors in the DRC and Central Africa in general?
Well, thank you, Michael. A very good question. My spiritual mentor in politics of Pan-Africanism, and not in a very narrow sense, in the real big story of getting Africa together, is none other than Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. I have been following him since he left Lincoln University. I have had some of my people that advised me in business, both in America and here, were with him at Lincoln University. I have a great respect for the work that he has done in bringing up the consciousness. You might recall the statement that he made when Ghana, when the Gold Coast was renamed Ghana, when he said that, "Seek ye first the political kingdom, and everything shall be granted up to you." Well, I followed that statement, but I also found some how can I put it, some inconsistency in that. It doesn't just work that way. But we must not take the letter. We've got to take the spirit in which that statement was made. So he's a great influencer on me. And although his life ended up in Conakry because of what happened, for me, he's still my hero. And I don't make heroes that easily. The story of Patrice Lumumba is a very sad one. Is one that needs to be. We need to remind our kids and grandkids about how cruel and how that colonialism and imperialism can be, or were, and damaging to this economy, to the African continent in particular. You have to look at the balkanization of Africa that happened at Berlin at the Congress is brought in its wake a huge amount of damage to the Africanized, to the understanding of the unity, the Pan-Africanism, that's what I'm talking about, of the African continent. We became used to the artificial borders. So coming closer to the subject of Patrice Lumumba, knowing his country, the DRC, and the resources that country commanded and still commands and remains as poor and undeveloped as it is, it's our job, and I make it mine, to continually remind ourselves that the scramble for the jewels of that lie under the belly of the earth of DRC will continue until such time as African leaders have understood that message that came from the forebears who founded the OAU, but it's starting to happen, that Africa has to unite. I mean, the formation of this Africa Free Trade Organization is a consequence of the teachings of Kwame Nkrumah, of the teachings of Tafawa Balewa, of the teachings of Kenyatta, the teachings of those leaders that made it possible for us to understand who we are and who we should be and how we should act in Africa as Africans, not emulating Europeans, nor Americans, or other people from other continents, because our problems and our challenges are unique. We are still primarily a developing economy in general.
Okay, and then we have the next question from Chanel, who asks, who were the women political leaders that you looked up to as a young political activist?
Well, during my time, there was a lady, well, the name is going to disappear. You know what happens with time, my wife, if you can remind me, but she knows it is, but oh my gosh. But the top ones that come to my mind, believe it or not, one of them is a woman called Helen Suzman, and who, for some reason, people sometimes don't understand sufficiently, I don't think, what she stood for. I say this partly because when I was a prisoner on Robben Island, there were certain organizations like Amnesty International, Red Cross that had access in terms of international protocols to know how we were treated as political prisoners on Robben Island. And she made it her job occasionally to come and have a look-see as to the treatment that was meted out to political prisoners on Robben Island, including the plight of Robert Sobukwe, who was also isolated on Robben Island, although he had completed his prison sentence. But there are quite a number. Charlotte Mateke, who was the first African woman to obtain a degree, is one that comes to my mind. Miss Albertina Sisulu is certainly Miss Patricia DeLille. There's quite a number of outstanding women within the political sphere of the day when I was still a young kid that influenced me and that stood out as political leaders who had a scope for what this country should look like.
Okay, so Tebogo Motaboli first starts by thanking you for sharing your experiences with us. And the question reads as follows. With that much brutality, how did most of your generation avoid revenge on the white groups and government functionaries? Like land seizure without compensation of Malema and his party, what do you think is the direction to remove inequality in South Africa?
Why we did not take vengeance on those that persecuted us was primarily I think, the influence of the leader of our transformation and of our democracy, President Nelson Mandela. You know, you will recall how he went out of his way to seek, and I've told you about the consultations he used to have. That I've told you about my personal involvement, but I was just one of many senior people. When I visited the Bahamas in not too long, about 10 years ago, I was received by the wife of the former president of the Bahamas, my wife and I, who told us that during the period when Mr. Mandela was seeking for a sustainable solution for South Africa, whatever things he did is he visited the Bahamas and wanted to understand what was their recipe for a peaceful, growing economy that had become a haven even for businesses, you know, and that taught me something, that here was a man who was genuinely seeking for a sustainable solution, knowing that his time as a leader was limited. He needed to sustain us, and I think many of us. I'm younger than I'm not younger than Dr. Mandela, but his influence on me, his influence on many, remains, and the preachings of people like him and others in our political movements across the spectrum of Black politics and liberal politics was that there is no point in destroying and creating chaotic conditions that might pose a risk for foreign direct investment in the future. We needed to portray South Africa as a country open for business, which had the ability to restrain, because we are the majority as Africans, but restraint from emotional outbursts based on a sustained period of repression would pose a disaster and a risk for continued growth, given also the rate of growth, population growth, and more. And finally, I think there was also consideration, at least from the groups that I was influential in. We felt the need that South Africa, with its highly industrialized nature and infrastructure, will continue to be the gateway for, to use a common phrase, for the systems required, a gateway into trade with the rest of the continent. Just because our systems, our infrastructure, our banking side of things is truly competes with the best in the world. So it was important that we do not, and we were discouraged, and I am particularly pleased that there has been a relative amount of restraint, although the use of today, perhaps epitomized by the younger organizations like the EFF, is one that also needs to be, in a sense, reined in. One understands the anger. It's perhaps the anger we had when we were growing up, but you know, the South Africa is the center of attraction for investment, and has always been, because of its abilities and its ability to well, first of all, because of just what we have, what has been created not only by our oppressors, because they by themselves could not have built an economy like us without the contribution of the majority of South Africans, which are Black Africans.
Okay, and then I have a personal question as well as a young South African. Well, I'm just interested, how can young people like myself today in South Africa continue to fight for social justice and inequality and equality? And what lesson can we learn from the struggle against apartheid?
What was the first part of your question? How can young people?
How can young people today continue to fight for social justice and equality? And what lessons can we learn from the struggle against apartheid?
Yeah, you know, there is nothing that works as well as creating an institutional framework for whatever you want to achieve. The world and economies rely on sustainable institutions, whether they be civil institutions, business, labor, that coalesce from time to time and debate their different points of view on how to move forward, including youth groups. So we need to continue to create dialogue among whether they're women groups, and women have become a significant part of the of how we operate. Women, I work for an organization which has taught me. Well, I don't work there. I'm associated with it. But I found that women, through their groupings, liaise more and talk more and debate issues more in groups than we do as young people, young men. So you young folks, I spoke about restraint earlier on, but while you're restrained, you have to debate and continue to want to influence institutions that can bring about some change, whether they are banks, whether they are government, whether they are civil society. But if you don't create those institutions and make them viable and make them attractive for society to invest in them, so that they must have a future, we will speak a small, unorganized groupings. But as I said at the beginning of my statement, there can't be sustainability without infrastructures, frameworks that are properly governed and can create respect for themselves.
Yeah. Okay, and then we have the next question from Jocelyn. She first starts thanking you for sharing your life stories with us. And the question goes as follows. I would love to hear more about your experiences in the United States and potentially what experiences you had with the civil rights movements or racism going on here while you studied.
Well, that's a very good question. As you can imagine, go back to the mid-1970s when I left this country. I left here shortly after my release. So the drive for freeing South Africa never escaped me. Even while I was a Fulbright scholar in the United States, I was always conscious of what I had left behind and my role in the liberation struggle. When I say liberation, I mean for it in a comprehensive sense. So I remained committed to my studies, but also found time during my spare time to see how I can create some kind of dialogue with again, with institutions that were favorable towards a changing society and in South Africa. So I had to make some adjustments, clearly, but because I had made myself familiar, excuse me, with the civil rights strife and was an admirer of the leaders of the civil strife movements, civil, what do you call it? Well, anyway, you know what I'm saying. The drive for African Americans to have a seat at the table. I was able to distinguish between what the struggle was in America and what was our struggle. And I think that many of the people that I started to communicate with, including the leaders of what is called the Trans-African movement, which was led by one able gentleman called Randall Robinson, and his movement, the Black Congressional Congress that I was introduced to. The leader at the time, I have written a lot about that in my book, and most importantly, I shared my own experiences to their groupings on the situation. Sorry, on the disinvestment campaign, which the American Congress had already instituted, and that movement requires some of us, and that were South Africans living in America, to address groupings, whether at universities or in churches or in civil rights groups, about what the situation was in South Africa. I totally immersed myself and put away a lot of my time away from the family and my studies in crisscrossing the United States from West Coast to East Coast. I spoke at California, UCLA, I've spoken at Harvard, MIT, Midwestern universities, pleading with them among, as a South African, among Americans that shared our view that American corporations and pension funds should disinvest from businesses doing, American companies doing business in South Africa. It is common and commonly known, and it is on record that I had fully, that I wasn't a full-time participant, but I was an active participant because the struggle that I had fought for, that I'd spent my youth for in South Africa, had not yet been accomplished. And so I was not going, and remember I was, thereafter I became a permanent resident in the United States. I had a great job. I worked for Citibank, I work on Wall Street. So, I lived the life. And I don't want to sound like a hero, but there was always something nagging me that the struggle was not complete in South Africa. That is why in the middle of the 80s, when there was a huge strife here in South Africa, I and my family returned to join the bank I had worked for in America, Citibank, and started my journey that we talked about earlier of Black economic empowerment. I started my journey and joined all the groupings. And again, I go back to those institutions, because you cannot accomplish much if you are not part of groups that are well organized. So yeah, I think that I take a lot out of my experience, and I'm always grateful for those Americans that housed us, that were sympathetic, but not just passively, but actively sympathetic in assisting our cause in the United States. When I can remember that when I was heading up the African Bank, which is the first Black-owned bank in South Africa, one of the things that I had to do was to go back to the United States to seek capital and technical assistance to grow this financial institution so we can train more bankers. And I became a member of the American Minority Bankers Association in the United States, so I can coalesce with presidents of those banks. And that way I was able to send young bankers from my bank to be trained in financial systems. And some of them have gone on their own and they have grown, but they still continue to make a contribution to South Africa. So I've never seen myself just as a political animal. I am an agent for social political change in South Africa and indeed on the continent.
Okay, so we have another question from Dr. Spears, which I think you have partially answered. So he starts by thanking you for joining us today, and then he has a macro question, which is related to the ANC government. Was there never a comprehensive plan after independence to shape South African politics in ways for the education system to produce the economics, political, and educational leaders needed to Africanize the South African political economy and the military for that matter? If not, why not?
Well, I think that is a good question, but I think whoever's asking the question assumes that I'm a leader in the ANC, which is not the question. I have not described myself in any way as a political leader. I said I was a fighter for liberation, and that does not make it cast me into any grouping. Yes, I was a member of the ANC Youth League when I grew up. I then became a member of the Pan-Africanist Party. I then became a business person that left politics on his own, and I prescribed for myself an area where I thought I would be effective, and an area that I understood well, whose principles I was trained in, and left the politics and the political policy developments for the politicians. In our grouping in the Black Business Council, when we founded it in 1994, we invited the African National Congress leadership, and the top of them, including the current president, came to our camp in Mopani in the Kruger Park because they were a government in waiting. We had prepared a scope of what we thought were important things to achieve in the first few years of democracy, which was going to be governed by the ANC. We met with the Minister of Finance to be, the Minister of Public Works to be, and I said, including the current president, Honorable President Ramaphosa. So there is also on record what the deliberations were. The newspapers reported it fully in their front line, in the lead pages. So I cannot, to answer the question in brief, answer for a political movement that has done such a great job in bringing us to where we are, and that I continue to think that has made mistakes, but it's trying to redress those mistakes. Because I'm not in the political space, I'm afraid I'm unable to answer the question, did the ANC prepare a plan or a blueprint for the future? Maybe they did, maybe they did not, but they would be best to answer that question. Best place to answer that question.
Okay, so I'm just going to take the last two questions, and then I'll hand over back to Professor Makoni, and then we'll head straight to our after party. But I'm just going to ask a follow-up question from Abosede, who first start by thanking you for joining this session. And the question reads as follows: why many people like you who endured the brutality of the apartheid regime decided not to pursue political offices in order to transform the South African society from within the sphere of power?
I have been asked that question over and over again. I still get asked that question today. The answer is as simply that I had no aspirations, personal aspirations for politics. I thought that I had done what I needed to do to help create the platform for democracy. And my participation in that area for me had ended there, as I said earlier. Now, I have to say that at the beginning, 1994, when we entered into, just before, in the transition period between apartheid and democracy, some of us, including myself, were involved in the Transitional Executive Council, that was called, which was a council which was created to make for a peaceful and smooth transition by dismantling the, for example, the Bantustans or the homelands, and creating a provincial systems, and also encouraging structures in those provinces to create proper governance. I was involved quite a bit in that process. In at least 3 of South Africa's provinces, I was involved, and I'm very happy that I was called upon for those few years at the beginning of our democracy to play that role. I advised some ministries, like the Ministry of Transport at some stage. I also advised the Ministry of Finance in the creation of financial portfolio structures within some of the provinces. And so let it be understood that that is where my role ended, because my role for me was cast in the financial sector space, which I still am in, even in my days of retirement.
Okay. I would now like to hand over to Professor Makoni to make his closing remarks, and then we will head straight to our after party. Prof. Makoni.
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Magomola. I think this was a very illuminating conversation, and your responses to the questions that were being raised by my colleagues from different parts of the world were very enlightening. I think it just confirms what we initially thought, that in order for us to broaden our horizons, we need to invite for discussions people who have had very successful and impactful careers outside the narrow world of academia. On behalf of my colleagues and our mutual friend, I again say thank you very much. Fundo, now we are open to what is called the after party. It's not moderated, it's not recorded. If anybody wants to jump in and ask any questions, they can feel free to do so.